What a wonderful day!
Hello and welcome to Ape Nation, your #1 source for all things Planet of the Apes on YouTube. My name is Josh, and today I am at last giving you my spoiler-filled review of the latest entry in the Planet of the Apes series and the fourth in the rebooted continuity that started with the beloved Caesar trilogy, Wes Ball's Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. If you like what I do here and want to show your support, be sure to hit the like button on this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so that you can stay up to date on all things apes. And for one final time, at least until we get the next Planet of the Apes movie, let's take a little bit of a deep dive into the film's behind-the-scenes history. In October of 2016, Dawn and War for the Planet of the Apes director Matt Reeves said that he had ideas for a fourth film in the Planet of the Apes reboot series and would later, alongside co-writer Mark Bomback, express further interest in sequels. Reeves said that Steve Zahn's character, Bad Ape, established a primate world much larger than just Caesar's group of apes, adding that there are apes who grew up without the benefit of Caesar's leadership, and suggesting that the conflict would arise if Caesar's apes should encounter such outsiders. Bomback suggested that other filmmakers could work on a sequel later on, and that it could take place hundreds of years after War. Nearly 2 years after the release of War, and following the acquisition of 20th Century Fox, the Walt Disney Company announced that further Planet of the Apes films were in development in April of 2019. In December of that same year, it was announced that Wes Ball would write and direct the film after having previously worked with Matt Reeves on a film adaptation of Mouse Guard. After that film was canceled by Disney following the Fox merger, the studio approached Ball for a new Planet of the Apes film. In February 2020, following several incorrect reports and rumors that the new film would be a reboot, Ball confirmed that the film would not be a reboot and would be set in the same universe as the Caesar trilogy. In April of 2020, it was announced that Peter Chernin, who produced the previous installments through Chernin Entertainment, would serve as executive producer. The next month, it was revealed that Josh Friedman would co-write the script with Ball, and that Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver would return to produce the film after doing so for the previous installments. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, Ball and Friedman would discuss the script through Zoom video calls. Due to the CGI-heavy nature of the film, virtual production was able to begin early on despite the limitations of the pandemic. After more than 2 years of development, Owen Teague joined the cast of the film in the lead motion capture role in August 2022. 1 month later, Freya Allen and Peter Macon joined the cast, and the title was officially revealed to be Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, with the film set to take place many years after the events of War. Around the same time, Rise screenwriters Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver, as well as Patrick Azon, writer of the 2022 Predator film Prey, joined the writing team, with Wes Ball no longer credited as the screenwriter. In October 2022, Ika Darville, Kevin Durand, Travis Jeffrey, Neil Sandilands, Sarah Wiseman, and Lydia Peckham had all been cast in motion capture roles, while William H. Macy and Deachin Lackman were cast later in January and February of 2023. Leading up to the film's release, Wes Ball stated that the film was set during the Dark Ages, where the apes rediscover lost items from the past in this grand adventure. He felt the protagonist Noah was neither a child nor adult, but a figure placed in extraordinary circumstances and living in a nomadic ape tribe. He compared the antagonist, Proximus, to that of inventor Thomas Edison, as he had rediscovered electricity, which was knowledge lost during the Dark Ages. As with the previous 3 Planet of the Apes films, the visual effects were handled by Weta Digital, with Ball stating that the film did not use the volume technology, which had previously been employed for and made famous by The Mandalorian, focusing on filming on location and using full CGI. It went on to compare the film's CG to that of James Cameron's Avatar franchise. Following all of the trailers, a viral marketing campaign was kicked off in California, with actors wearing realistic ape costumes on horseback were seen traveling to Venice Beach and Crissy Field, as well as in New York City, leading up to the release of the film. Although the film was originally set for a May 24th release date, it was moved up 2 weeks earlier in January 2024 to May 10th in order to avoid competition with Furiosa, a Mad Max saga, and the Garfield movie during Memorial Day weekend. The music for the film was composed by Wes Ball's longtime collaborator, and most well known for his work on Netflix's Daredevil series, composer John Pisano. Toronto. The film was shot from October 2022 through February 2023, with filming taking place throughout Sydney, Australia. The film was made for an estimated budget of around $160 million and was released on May 10th, 2024 to very positive critical and audience reviews, taking in a domestic opening weekend of $58.5 million, as well as a worldwide opening weekend total of $131.2 million. The film will need to make an estimated number of somewhere between $330 and $400 million to break even more in order to be profitable, but the total worldwide box office will not be known for at least another month or so. As for my experience with Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, this is a movie that I had been waiting for ever since the end of war, and I wanted to see something set in the far future, or they could have just jumped forward and made a remake of the original movie set in this world. That was something that I immediately thought of after the war ended back when I saw in 2017. I was just like, I want to see where the rest of this universe goes. I want to see them build it out more. I want to see maybe they set a movie 1,000 years in the future or just do a remake of the original. And so when this movie was first announced, I was immediately on board. And then once Wes Ball was announced as the director, I felt like kind of a lone voice for the most part, that I was actually very excited and I was very happy with the choice. And for the most part, all the criticisms I saw were just, he's the guy who did the Maze Runner and it's not Matt Reeves, so it's gonna suck. And I'm just someone who is always looking on the bright side of things. I tend to be a lot more optimistic for things. Sometimes it bites me in the ass and sometimes it doesn't, but I like to look on the bright side and I like to be looking forward to things as much as I possibly can, especially with franchises and things that I care about. And so knowing that Wes Ball had done the Maze Runner movies, the biggest takeaway for me was, as much as I don't think these are like the greatest movies ever, I don't think they're as bad as some people have made them out to be. And to be honest, outside of the Hunger Games, they're probably the best movies to come out of that whole young adult craze that was the big thing for the early 2010s. And I think his directing in those is a big reason why. I think the intensity, I think the visuals, I think the shot compositions in those movies is better than it has any right to be, and it elevates what I think is for the most part not really great source material, at least in my opinion. And so I was looking forward to seeing what he could do with it. Obviously there was still a lot up in the air. Were Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver going to come back? Who was going to be writing it? Who's it going to be about? Is Caesar going to be referenced? Is it going to be even taking place in this universe? There were a lot of questions up in the air, and over the next few months, over the next year or so, we got a lot of questions answered. We found out who's going to be writing it. We found out obviously Rick Jaffa and Amanda Silver were coming back. Wes Ball reassured that it's going to take place in that same universe and that a lot of the same creative team is going to be working on the movie. And also, of course, the fact that he had worked with Matt Reeves and Andy Serkis on his Mouse Guard movie that never got made. And so I think a lot of these things kind of just got overlooked when this movie first got announced and Wes Ball first got announced to be doing it, and people were just not interested in another movie that wasn't directed by Matt Reeves, which that's a whole other conversation I could have regarding directors not coming back to do a movie. Franchises move on from directors all the time and they're fine. Sometimes they're not fine and there's reason for concern. But in this case, especially since this is not the first time it's happened with this franchise, I was not concerned at all. We had Rupert Wyatt going to Matt Reeves. Now we have Matt Reeves going to Wes Ball. And I'm sure at some point we'll go from Wes Ball to somebody else, whether it's for the next movie or a movie after that or so on and so forth. But I was not concerned at all and I was actually very excited. And then over the next year and a half, we didn't really hear much. We just knew that it was being worked on. It was in pre-production. It was in development. And then eventually we started seeing actors cast. We started finding out a little more details about when it might take place. We saw that it was filming and all that kind of stuff, but we didn't really get too much until we got that first trailer late last year. Up until then, it was pretty much radio silent. And then we got the first trailer.
That is not everything.
Similar to the lead up to Rise, up until that point, I was just constantly trying to find any information I could get. And then once we got that first trailer was when I made the decision to start this channel after months and months of considering doing it. And for the most part, I think you all know the rest as far as my experience with this movie goes. And now we're here. And when I saw the movie just under a week ago now, I thought it was I had a great time. I had some issues with it. And then over this last weekend, I went to see it with my parents. Both my parents really enjoyed it and I liked it a lot more. And on second viewing, it kind of made some of my issues with the movie go away a bit, and it made me appreciate the stuff that I liked a lot more. And overall, I really enjoyed this movie. This is a really great return to the Planet of the Apes franchise. I really loved the character of Noah. I think Proximus is a great villain, underutilized, but overall a really great villain who's a really interesting character. I'm fascinated by what they're doing with May and the human side of the story. Overall, it's a really grand and epic and fun adventure film, but it still has something interesting to say, and it still tonally falls in line with what was done before, but while doing its own thing. And I'm still not 100% sure where it ranks in the series for me. I'll definitely get to that when I do my ranking video at the end of this month. But for the most part, this is a movie that I think that does the Planet of the Apes name justice, and it continues this world in a really interesting and exciting way, and I'm excited to talk all about why. Set several generations in the future following Caesar's reign, apes are the dominant species living harmoniously, and humans have been reduced to living in the shadows. As a new tyrannical ape leader builds his empire, one young ape undertakes a harrowing journey that will cause him to question all that he has known about the past and to make choices that will define a future for apes and humans alike. As usual, starting things out with the cast and with the characters, we have Owen Teague, who takes the reins of Andy Serkis in leading this franchise moving forward and playing the character of Noah. Noah is a character who I was very excited about just knowing what we were getting with him. He is a very Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, Frodo Baggins, I think actually is the most accurate comparison for a character like this. I mean, that was something that we haven't really seen in this franchise up to this point. So I was very excited for that. I love that hero's journey. I love that young adult coming of age kind of character that we've seen in so many movies and so many kind of mythic fantasy and science fiction franchises. And within the first 10-15 minutes, I was immediately on board with this character. I think Owen Teague is really compelling as the lead. He gives such a strong performance throughout the entire thing. Of course, nobody is going to live up to Andy Serkis. Andy Serkis is one of the greatest actors working today. Nobody was ever going to be able to live up to what Andy Serkis is going to do or top what Andy Serkis is going to do. But I think for what Owen Teague does in this movie, he forges his own path as a lead of a Planet of the Apes movie, and he does it very, very well. I think the way he uses his eyes, you can really see Owen Teague in this performance and in this CGI character. And Noah is a very different kind of protagonist than Caesar, but he has a lot of similarities as well, and he's a very noble young hero type of character. He has a lot of room to grow as well, and I'm excited to see more of him and where his story goes, where his development goes, which direction he is ultimately going to take. And so overall, I was very happy with Noah in this movie. I really enjoyed his arc across the entire movie, going from this character in a small tribe who has no knowledge of the outside world, no real knowledge of humans, or echoes as they call them in this movie. And then when you get to the end of this movie, he's so much more knowledgeable about the world now. You see that he is ready to go outside and explore and learn more and possibly go on to greater and bigger things. And it's really exciting to me, and I loved going on that journey with him, and hopefully it will lead to even bigger journeys to come. I think he's a great protagonist for this new story, and I am very, very excited for what we are going to get with him, assuming we get more movies. Following up Owen Teague, we have Freya Allan in the main human role, who plays May. And overall, I think that she gives a really solid performance here. I think what she has to do is very hard for a lot of actors, and she does it really, really well. She also just has this very, I don't know how to describe it, just a look that feels like she belongs in the Planet of the Apes world. And I think just as far as a character goes, May is really interesting, and I love the ambiguity of her and her goals and where her loyalties lie. As the movie progresses, you see where she goes, and you see by the end that her and Noah are not necessarily on good terms, but they are still kind of allies, but they're not in everything with her and what she's ultimately trying to achieve and what her mission is. I really appreciated that about her, and it was a very different kind of character than I was expecting, and it just got me more intrigued to see where she's ultimately gonna go. The only thing for me is I just wanted to actually get to know more of her as a person and see her character fleshed out a little bit more. But on the other hand, the more I think about the movie and the more I think about her character, I don't necessarily know if I need that for this particular story, and I kind of think that that was almost intentional to not really get to know her that well, because it leaves you by the end going, I don't necessarily know what side she's going to be on by the end of this story. Again, assuming we get to see the end of this story. And I really like that. It's something different, and it's this very ambiguous place to be. But overall, I really enjoyed her and what she had to offer in the movie. Then, of course, we had Kevin Durand as the villain of the film, Proximus Caesar. This is the character that I was the most excited about going into the movie. I think this was what a lot of people, if not most people, were most excited about going into. This character was basically the headliner for all of the marketing in the movie. And while I do have some gripes with how the character's used, for me, Kevin Durand is excellent in the role, and he steals every single scene that he is in. I just wish there were more scenes of him, because he only really shows up maybe 4 or 5 times in the entire movie, and he maybe gets like 15 total minutes of screen time. Granted, actual total screen time isn't really that relevant of a thing. I mean, you look at Darth Vader in the original Star Wars, who's in that movie for 10 minutes, but he leaves such an impact. And I think this is, to a degree, a similar situation, although I'm not saying think he's even close to Darth Vader. But still, I think what he does in this movie is really impactful, and there's this thing about him where, despite all these really twisted methods that he has, and the fact that he is a dictator and he has just decided that he is the ruler of apes and he is the one who has properly taken Caesar's teachings and doing what he thinks is best for them, despite the fact that we all as viewers know that no, that is not the true teachings of Caesar. I think his actual ideals to some degree aren't entirely wrong. His beliefs about humans aren't entirely wrong, and we see that proven towards the end of the movie with what happens with May. And overall, I think he's a very effective and very charismatic as far as both the performance and the character goes, and he's also just a really scary villain. I think giving him just one or two more really meaty, depth-filled scenes would have made his ending, where he unfortunately meets his end and he falls off the cliff, it would have made that feel way more impactful, and it would have felt way more earned for me. When we get to that moment, it just didn't hit as hard as I wanted it to do, and this was the case unfortunately on both viewings, but I think he could come back in a later movie, and I still really appreciate the character. I think what he adds to the movie is fantastic. I think he's one of the highlights of the movie when he is there, and I love the ideas that he brings to the table and that the movie explores with him as far as religious fanaticism that I'll get to a little bit later in this review. Then moving on from Proxima Caesar, we have Peter Macon as Raka, who I think is another standout of the movie, which is why for me his death hits really hard, and I had almost borderline tears in my eyes when I watched this for the first time and he ultimately meets his end. Now, I don't completely believe that he's dead. Apparently at the end of the credits you can hear the sound of an orangutan, which is similar to what they did with Koba at the end of Dawn, but we ultimately did not see Koba come back. So it could mean something, it could mean nothing, I'm not really sure, but I have a feeling he's going to come back. He's just too good of a character, he's too fun, and he's too, I think, essential to Noah's journey, so I think there's a good chance he comes back. But regardless, I loved this character for the time that we did have him for the first hour or so of this movie, and Peter Macon's voice for him is so perfect for this character. He gives a really funny and really heartfelt performance, and I think the dynamic between Raka and Noah is really special and it's really sweet, and you care about the two of them as a pairing and as friends within the first 5 minutes of them meeting. Introduces you to relationships and it gets you to care about them, and it develops them just enough to when something happens you are really invested and you really care a lot. Moving on from Raka, we also have Lydia Peckham as Suna and Travis Jeffrey as Anaya. These are Noah's two friends, and these are also two characters that I was very much looking forward to going into this movie, and they did not disappoint. I loved the optimism and heart of Suna, and I think Lydia Peckham, more than a lot of the ape actors up there with Owen Teague, does a really great job with her eye acting and the expressiveness more than most. And going off of what I was talking about earlier with Raka, I think her dynamic with Noah is really special, and I'm very excited to see that explored more. That is a relationship that I'm really looking forward to seeing how they move that forward. And then with Travis Jeffrey as Anaya, I think he's such a funny character. He's very much the wannabe tough guy of the group, that almost comedic relief character of the trio, but deep down he has just as much of a strong heart as his friends, and his loyalty to them is really moving in a few scenes. Of course, the scene in the third act when they are going for the climb and he comes to join them after initially being scared. I really liked that moment, and it really spoke to who he is as a character and who this trio is as a group of friends. And so overall, I really liked Suna and Anaya, and seeing the trio of those two along with Noah is an aspect of this potential trilogy that I am very excited about. In a secondary villain role, but a very impactful and memorable one, you have Ika Darville as Silva, who is way more menacing and memorable than I was ever expecting him to be. This is very much a typical second-in-command bad guy henchman type of character, but he's really menacing and he's really intense in every single scene. The only critique I'd say I have with him isn't necessarily with him, but because he is the one who ultimately kills Noah's father in the beginning of the movie, I wanted the movie to use that as more of a driving force for Noah when these two finally have their big conflict and their big fight towards the end. They don't quite utilize that emotional payoff as well as I wish they would have, but overall I think the character still works really well, and I do like what they did with him. And then speaking of Noah's father, we have Neil Sandilands as Koro, as well as Sarah Wiseman as Dar, who are both of Noah's parents. I really liked Koro a lot. He's a really cool character with a lot of potential that I just wish we'd gotten more of. I wish we'd just gotten maybe one or two more scenes between him and Noah in the beginning that would have gotten me a bit more engaged in their relationship. But as a character, I was really interested in him. I like that kind of wise, tough on his son father. That's a bit of a trope, but I think it was executed really well. And then as far as Dar, I really liked her. I thought Sarah Wiseman did a great job with the voice and with the performance, and I think it's just an overall really enjoyable character that I think we'd hopefully like to see more of if we get it. She has a really sweet mother and son dynamic with Noah, and I think think they utilize that just well enough. And then finally rounding out the cast with the other main human character, we have William H. Macy, who I'm a big fan of, who I've seen obviously in many things throughout the years. My favorite of his still being Boogie Nights, but William H. Macy is in this movie as Trevathan, and I really like him in the role. The character himself I think is interesting, and I could see him having a really fascinating backstory if they ever were to explore that in like a book or a comic, but definitely getting to know who he was leading up to this story I think would be really interesting to see. But aside from being a plot device, the character doesn't really get to do all that much, so I would have liked to see him explored a little bit. But that being said, the movie is focused on other things and doesn't really have time for that, so I think for the most part he's used about as well as he can be. And as always, William H. Macy is great and does really well in the role. Now getting into more of the story of the movie, what I really liked, especially in comparison to the previous three movies, is how refreshing it was. And it was such a unique and different type of story and type of overall narrative structure than we'd gotten in those first three movies. And like I've mentioned it multiple times leading up to this movie, and like Wes Ball and many others have mentioned many times, it has a very Joseph Campbell classical hero's journey inspiration that it's kind of going for, but within the confines of the Planet of the Apes world. And because of that, it's a much more simplistic story than the past films. And so it's a bit more driven by the character building and the mythology and the world building of it all. And I actually really enjoy that. I thought it was a nice change of pace. I liked how it really just takes its time building out this world and setting up these characters and letting you go on this adventure with them and just getting to know them and grow to care about them through what for the most part is a very simple, straightforward kind of story. And I also really love how much time you get to spend in this world and with these characters even before getting to Proximus's kingdom. I've seen some people say that the fact that Proximus doesn't even show up until about an hour into the movie is a bad thing. I actually really liked that. I like that we hear about Proximus here and there. We get a bit of a build up and then finally we're introduced to him halfway through the movie. It reminds me very much of the way that the Colonel was handled in War for the Planet of the Apes, and I like that choice. I like that structure, and it makes the story feel very grand in scale and lets you just live in this apes world and with these characters for a while. So like I said earlier, you get to know and care about them. And when it comes to humanity and the human side of things, I like that there is this aspect of humans with, especially when you get to the end and you find out what's really going on, that humans are still alive underground and they're trying to rebuild, and it sets the stage for a future that is completely up in the air and builds a lot of exciting possibilities. You know, we could go into something like nuclear war breaking out, or maybe a Planet of the Men type of story. And for those who don't know what that is, it is a sequel that never got made to the original Planet of the Apes, where the humans that were in the world banded together and fought back against the apes after they had already taken over. So maybe we'll get to something like that, you know. But the story that is told here, while it is very simple, it's very straightforward, it introduces a lot of really interesting and exciting concepts, and the grand scale and the structure of it all and the way it goes about engaging you and taking you on this journey, I was all for it. I thought it worked really well, and I think, like I said, it sets the stage for something a bit deeper and something a bit more epic when we get to the second film. Again, as always, assuming we get that second film. Now, I've mentioned world building a lot in this review, more than I have, I think, in most of my Planet of the Apes reviews, and that's because I think this movie handles it the best and in the most interesting way, probably since the original 1968 movie. And I said this in my spoiler-free review, but I'll say it again here. I honestly think it might do it even better and have more to do in that regard than that original 1968 movie. I think the world building in this film is excellent, and it's so well utilized throughout the entire thing. I love the way that human history is used to build out this post-apocalyptic world in a really visually striking way, and the evolution of the apes feels very authentic, and I loved that the apes are still very ape-like and they aren't fully evolved at this point. They all speak now. They're no longer just speaking sign language with a few English words here and there. It's all English, and now with a little bit of sign language here and there. And also their English is much stronger, their vocabulary is much wider, and like I said, the sign language is still very much a part of their culture, and I like that that's still a part of their culture. And there are still some primitive traits throughout their society, and I'm really fascinated to see how much further they get by the end of this potential trilogy with how apes speak and how apes communicate and what they're capable of. And I actually don't really agree with the criticism that I've seen that they should be smarter and more evolved by now. It's only been 300 or so years, and when you look at human history, how slowly we evolved from cavemen. 300 years after the dawn of man, we were not where we are now. We weren't even somewhat close. We weren't even like 20 to 30% of the way to where we are right now. Humans humans were still very much a primitive species at that point, and apes are following that same trajectory. It's going to be another 1,000 or so years before apes are doing things like wearing clothes, having buildings built everywhere, you know, doing things like driving cars or something like that. It's going to be a long time before apes are at that point. And so I really liked the evolution. It felt very natural and it felt very authentic to what has been built in this series so far. I also think that the human tech element, with all that stuff being rediscovered, it opens up a lot of doors and makes me wonder what we'll see apes doing by the end of this story in terms of technology and what they're capable of technologically. It is going to be very interesting to see how all that evolves. And I also love, more than anything, the way that the Order of Caesar and how Caesar's legacy has evolved in this movie. It's really powerful and it's really thought-provoking. And again, I'll have more to say on it later, but the way that the different types of people that are aware of Caesar and that have followed Caesar take his teachings in different ways, and they use it in different ways, whether it be for personal gain or for the betterment of ape kind, I think is really, really interesting and fascinating stuff that this movie does well with. And it also just continues to build out what Caesar's legacy did and how it continues to impact apes and all of the different societies of apes that have grown and evolved since Caesar's reign. And then as far as the overall filmmaking of the movie is concerned, I think Westfall's direction feels right in line with what Rupert Wyatt did when kicking off the Caesar trilogy with Rise, and also feels in line with what Matt Reeves did kind of tonally, and it follows what those films overall did as far as how they presented their story, but he does it in his own way and continues to add his own voice similar to what Matt Reeves did following Rupert Wyatt. And I really like what he brings to the table. His filmmaking here is really, really strong. The overall look of the film is incredibly stunning. The movie visually is just such an achievement to look at in pretty much every scene, and it evokes so much imagery that feels like a bridge between the world of Caesar and the 1968 movie. Of course, they're not in the same continuity, but that is still ultimately the goal, to get to a world that looks like that. And this movie very much feels, like I said, like a bridge between those two. And then in terms of just overall how Westfall tells this story, I mean, the opening scene I think perfectly sets the stage for new viewers, but it also gives so much respect to fans of the series before going on this journey, opening with the death and funeral of Caesar before going off into many generations later was such a smart and surprising move. I was not expecting that at all. I mean, I saw a couple of people thinking, oh, maybe there's this shot in the trailer that could be Caesar's funeral, and I never really took it that seriously. So when it happened, I was so shocked. So it was amazing to see that, and I thought it was a great way to start the movie. And then the tension throughout this thing is really, really well handled, and it's one of the most hyper intense movies in the entire Planet of the Apes series. And then when it comes to the pacing, I think initially it bothered me a bit on first viewing, just because I wasn't overall tuned into where the story was going and what the overall plot structure was. But I think once I got more of a handle on what it was and went in to see it a second time, it played a lot smoother for me. And that third act, the issues I had with it, I didn't really feel them as much on the second viewing. I do feel that the third act overall still is not quite what I was expecting, but in a way I do really like that. I appreciate that they went the way they did. And so overall, I think the pacing of the movie for the most part works very well. There's a couple moments here and there where it kind of dips and lags a little bit, but they're very few and far between, at least for me. Going back to what I said about Caesar earlier in the movie, the legacy of Caesar, it's handled with such reverence, and it feels very important to the world and to these characters, of course, especially Raka, but then also with Proximus Caesar, and then to a degree with Noah. And so I really like the way that's used in the movie as well. And Noah not knowing the history that we as the audience do, he creates this really interesting and unique viewing experience that you don't really get with a lot of franchise movies or just movies in general. Him being so new to this world is great for new audiences, but then it also gives a very unique perspective for us because we know what happened several hundred years ago, but he doesn't. It just makes for a really interesting and I think very fun viewing experience overall. And then something I also talked about in my spoiler-free review is the humor in the movie. I think it's used really well.
I have a name. May.
It's one of the funnier Planet of the Apes movies, but it's honestly not really that much funnier than War for the Planet of the Apes, which I still think is one of the funnier ones. And it's nowhere near something like Escape, which is basically a fish out of water comedy for at least a third of the movie. So it's not quite on those levels, but I think the humor is really well done. And what I really like is that they're not gags. It's just these natural moments that come from characters and their interactions. I think the shit joke is hilarious, and it's also a moment that I've wanted to see since Rise. I've wanted to see an ape say a curse word because I think it would be really funny as long as it's handled well, and I think the way it's handled is perfect in this movie. And then the relationships and the way those are handled in the movie, I think they're very effective, and they're for the most part pretty well developed, especially the ones between Noah and Suna and Anaya. I think the bond between those three and the dynamic between that trio is already almost as strong for me as Caesar, Maurice, and Rocket. Of course, we had 3 movies with those, but that trio hadn't really fully become what it became until the 3rd movie. Whereas in this one, we're off to a strong start with these 3 characters as a trio within the first few minutes of the movie, and they only get more and more compelling as a group by the end. So I think the relationships are great between those 3. I think the dynamic between Noah and Proximus is really interesting. The relationship between Noah and May is really interesting, especially when you get to the end and you see how it's all unfolded, and she has the gun and she's not fully trusting of him. He's not fully trusting of her, but they don't want to kill each other and they want to be able to coexist with each other. And so I really am fascinated by where that dynamics is going and how those 2 are going to continue forward if they are to stay somewhat allies or if that relationship is going to break apart. So I think the relationships are well utilized. There are a couple here and there, like I mentioned, Koro and Noah. I would have liked to see that fleshed out a little bit more before Koro's death. I think there could have been a little more done between Noah and Silva, but for the most part, I think it's very well done, very well realized stuff throughout. There's also some really great Easter eggs and some nods to the original movie as well as the Caesar movies, and none of them feel forced. They all fit very naturally into the world and into the storytelling that's happening. Even something that's very blatant and obvious, like the doll, where they straight up use the exact piece of audio from the 1968 movie. Is something that doesn't really distract you. It's something that if you know it, it's awesome and it's fun to see, and if you don't know it, you're not even going to think anything of it. And that is the best type of Easter egg and use of nostalgia you can do, in my opinion. So I really liked everything they did with that. One other critique I do have on this movie, and I don't have a lot, but I've mentioned a couple, and one other that I do have is the development of certain story aspects. Now, like I just mentioned, I liked the development of certain characters and their relationships, but there's a few elements of the story that are meant to have this really strong payoff and they don't hit as well as they should. The stuff with the Eagles, I think could have been handled better. I like the idea of the Eagle clan and their relationship with the Eagles, but it's not really given that much time to shine. It's just kind of introduced in the beginning of the movie and mentioned once or twice, and then when we get to the final showdown with them, it's a great scene, but it doesn't have the impact or emotional weight it should for me, just because there's not really that much outside of the one scene with Noah and his dad's eagle where we really get to tap into that. So I wish that had been further fleshed out and given a bit more weight so that it hit harder at the end. And the same comes with Noah and Proximus. Like I said, I did like the dynamic between those 2 characters, but I think had we had another scene or 2 with Noah and Proximus interacting and getting to know each other and getting to understand each other, I think that final scene would have felt a bit more personal and it would have hit a lot harder, and I think his death would have felt a bit more earned and would have had a bit more of an impact on me emotionally. So I do think there are just a couple of things here and there, and there are probably a couple other things I could think of, but those are just the 2 that really stood out to me, where I wish they'd given a bit more time leading up to that finale to give that finale a bit more of an impact. And then speaking of finale, I want to get into the ending a little bit, and the ending to me feels very reminiscent of Rise, although in a bit more of a cliffhangery way, but for the most part very similar. It wraps up its own story, but it very clearly has more that can be told, and it ends in that same way where it's very hopeful, but it also raises doubts about the future for these characters. You know, the final shots of the movie are May after she's delivered that hard drive to the underground bunker that she's not allowed to go into. It opens up possibilities and it starts asking questions about, wait, humans are doing this, what's going on, what is her role in all of this? And then you see her go off and you see that look in her eye where at the end of the day, yeah, she completed her mission, but she's not really sure what she's actually doing, and she's not completely sure what side she's on and what she actually wants. And I think there's so many questions that are raised. And the same with Noah, that he is maybe going to be open to trusting humans, but he's not 100% sure, and he knows there's just so much more out there. I feel like he overcame the hurdle of this journey, but deep down knows there's probably something more coming, and he's ready to go out and find out what that is. And I thought it ended in a way that was very unexpected. So overall, I really enjoyed the ending, and I'm very excited to see where it leads, because I have some ideas that I want to talk about that I want to dedicate to its own individual video, but I definitely think I can see where they're going, and the possibilities are really exciting to me. And then, of course, there are the much talked about visual effects. And I don't need to reiterate what everyone else has already said, but it really is true. These are some of the best visual effects that have ever been put on screen. The CGI in this movie is jaw-dropping. There is almost not a single frame that looks fake, that looks overly CG. There are a couple things here and there that you can tell just because of the way things move, but for the most part, it's very seamless, especially with the close-up shots and very slower moving character moments. It looks just as good, if not better than War, and it really looks its best in the darkly lit scenes, again, very much similar to what Dawn and War had going for most of those movies' runtimes. And overall, I think it's not quite as photoreal just due to the overall heavier use of CGI throughout the entire movie than in the previous movies, because this movie uses a lot more CGI than the last three movies did, just because there aren't as many humans, there aren't as many human locations and human-based places, and just full human scenes outside, of course, of the ending scene. And this movie does something that the other movies didn't do, where it has a few CGI environments, and those CGI environments are incredible to look at. I mean, it's very evocative of what James Cameron did with the Avatar movies, but still, even though there is an overall heavier use of CGI, it's incredibly well used CGI, and it is very well done CGI. The apes also have slightly more human movement due to the time jump in them being a bit more evolved, and particularly Proximus and Silva. So it makes it a bit, not unbelievable, but it's almost in that uncanny valley territory where the apes look very real, but the way they're moving isn't quite exactly like an ape anymore, where in the first three movies it was very, very much like a real ape. And so that was something I just had to adjust to visually, but it doesn't bother me that much. It is just something I noticed and I thought was a really interesting choice. And then there's the music, composed by John Paisano, who worked with Wes Ball on the Maze Runner trilogy, and for me personally, I was very excited about him going into this movie just because I loved his music for the Insomniac Spider-Man games, as well as Netflix's Daredevil show, and overall I think he does a really solid job here. I will say his score overall is not as memorable as the previous three movies. What Patrick Doyle did with Rise and what Michael Giacchino did with Dawn and War, I think is just some of my favorite movie music to come out of the last decade or so, and so he had a lot to live up to, and I don't quite think he hit those highs as far as giving us a lot of really memorable moments and a lot of really heavy-hitting emotional stuff, but I do think the score works for what it needs to do. It does its job, and it does have some standout emotional moments here and there, especially in the second half of the movie, and there's a couple moments that are really stuck with me. I liked the music used in Raka's intro scene. I think the action scenes have some really intense pulse-pounding music. The scene where Noah and Suna and Anaya are all exploring inside the vault and seeing all the human remains, I think the music in there, the very soft music, is actually really good and actually stood out to me more than most of the music in the movie. So I think there's some really standout stuff. There's also some really great homages to all three of the Caesar movies. Of course, the opening scene with Caesar's funeral, you have straight up the music from the end of Dawn of the Planet of the Apes playing, which to me was a perfect way to start this movie. It starts you with what you know and then transitions you into something new. I thought that was a perfect way to go. And then there are a handful of cues that are used from those movies. There's a bit here that you hear from the Rise of the Planet of the Apes theme. There's a couple cues here that you hear from Dawn as well. And then most notably, there are two specific instances of music that is pulled directly from the 1968 movie. There is the human hunt scene, which has the music that is literally the same exact music that is used in that hunt scene from the original movie. And then there's this great little piano cue that I've always loved from the original score that is used on the bridge scene when Noah, May, and Raka are attacked by Proximus's apes. There's a great little cue there that I loved, that I picked up on. So there's some great homages here. It's overall a really solid score. Again, not quite reaching the heights of what came before, but it is still a really solid score that does its job for the movie. And then, of course, as far as the themes and ideals that this movie is exploring goes, the idea of religious fanaticism and leaders who distort truth for personal gain, I think that whole concept is really interesting, and the way that it's used through Proximus's character is really well done. I just wish it was taken a little bit deeper and had those ideologies explored a bit more. I wish maybe there was a scene with Proximus and either Raka or Noah maybe debating those ideologies and the teachings of Caesar and what they're supposed to actually be. So I think that was a really great idea. I just wish it was taken a bit further, but I do like that it was there, and I do like how it was used in general. I also think that this movie explores the treatment of the voiceless who now have a voice in society. I think that final scene between May and Noah, and there's a line that I really loved that Noah, I don't remember the exact quote, but he says, "Do you want us to just go back to silence?" And that line really stuck with me because it is very relevant to pretty much every generation of society, but today especially, I think. And I really appreciated that. I did not see it coming, and it really kind of caught me off guard when he said that because it was just such a non-subtle line. And so I really liked that. I'm hoping that we get to see that explored more throughout the trilogy. Again, if the trilogy gets made, I am hoping to see ideas like that explored further, how apes and humans could possibly coexist, and whether or not humans will try to repress apes or vice versa. So we'll see how that goes. And then also the hubris and relentlessness of human nature is something that is very much explored throughout this movie, with May constantly clinging on to the past and humans out there that are still trying to rebuild their society that they lost hundreds of years ago. It is an idea that is both very honorable, but also just goes to really prove what these movies have always been about, and that is, like I said, the hubris of humankind, in that they will just never stop until they own everything, until they are the dominant species, because they believe they are, because in a way that seems like it's just a part of human nature, and that is something that's always been explored in these movies, and so I hope it's a continuing theme. So overall, I think this is a really great movie. I think it's about on par with Rise in terms of quality, and it may be even a little bit better. I will say I don't think the highs of this movie are as high as the highs of Rise, but I think just overall it's a more consistently well-made movie, so I still might prefer Rise just due to personal attachment and those highs that come in that movie. And I've also just had way more time with that movie, so maybe I'll change my mind in the coming weeks or months, but I don't really know how I feel just yet. But I definitely don't think it's as good as Dawn or War. And like I said, it's a visually stunning movie, and it has great characters that you can root for, and it's just a fun adventure to go on, and it got me on board for another generation of movies in this franchise and in this timeline, and I am so excited to see where they go next. And in the era of legacy sequels to beloved films that continue stories many years later, this to me is a 101 in how to do it right. It leaves the past in the past, and it doesn't rely on what you already know and love, but it still respects the history and world as it moves forward and charts its own new and unknown path. It's the best of both worlds, and the most exciting way for me to follow up the Caesar trilogy that could have ever been done. So everybody, that was my spoiler-heavy review of Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes. I think this is a really great movie that you should absolutely go see if you haven't already. If you haven't seen it already, I don't know why you're watching this review, but if you haven't seen the movie yet, go check it out in theaters, go support it. I think it's a really great time, and I'm so happy that everyone, for the most part, seems to be really enjoying it just as much as I did. If you did see the movie, let me know your spoiler-filled thoughts down below. I want to know what you guys have to say. This was my final review for the Planet of the Apes movie series for the time being. Of course, this will not be my final review for Planet of the Apes stuff in general. There's still the TV shows, the video games, the books, comic books. There's so many things I want to review over the next several months and beyond that. So I have a lot of stuff I'm going to be announcing in the coming weeks and months about when things are going to be happening, but rest assured, everything Planet of the Apes will be reviewed on this channel, as well as so many other videos that I have planned. So with all of that said, thank you so much for checking out today's video here on Ape Nation. If you liked this video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so that you can stay up to date on all things apes. I'll catch you in the next one, so until then, goodbye.